In the summer of 1794, the city of Paris was drowning in its own breath. The heat pressed down like a punishment, sealing the streets beneath a film of smoke, sweat, and decay. You could taste the staleness in the air, a sour mixture of blood, rust, and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit from abandoned market stalls. Above it all, the sound that ruled the city was not song, nor prayer, nor laughter. It was the guillotine. Each strike of its blade sent a tremor through the heart of France, sharp, final, and echoing like the toll of an iron bell. It was the rhythm of a city that had mistaken death for deliverance. From sunrise to sundown, the crowds gathered in the Place de la Revolution, faces flushed and eager, their cheers blending with the dull thud of heads meeting wicker baskets. The reign of terror had reached its fever pitch, and the air itself seemed infected with hysteria. The stench of justice filled every corner. Beneath the bridges of the Seine, the water ran thick with residue from the day's purges. The smell of burnt powder and congealed blood lingered even after the executioners washed the scaffold. Drums beat with mechanical precision, summoning the condemned in endless procession. Each name shouted in the square was greeted with applause, as if the revolution itself demanded constant sacrifice to stay alive. But Robespierre's journey to this nightmarish end began not on the scaffold, but in the shadows of exhaustion and fear. By July 1794, he was 36 years old, still young, but aged by sleepless nights, whispered betrayals, and the crushing weight of purity he could no longer maintain. The revolution that had made him its prophet was beginning to doubt its own gospel, and the man once hailed as the incorruptible was now devoured by the corruption of certainty. Inside the headquarters of the Committee of Public Safety, the air was just as suffocating as the streets outside. The room was dim, lit by a handful of candles that bent and bled wax down to the ink-stained desks. Robespierre sat hunched over a pile of documents, lists of traitors, names of the condemned, his quill trembling between his fingers. His voice, once thunderous in the National Convention, had grown hoarse, reduced to whispers of accusation. Outside, the cries of the crowd echoed like a hymn. He could hear them through the cracked shutters, the same voices that had once chanted his name now calling for blood without reason or end. The guillotine's rope creaked like a heartbeat. The drums beat slower now, but heavier, as if they too were growing weary of the endless march of death. He rose from his chair and stepped toward the window. The July air struck his face like a furnace blast. From there, the entire city lay before him, the gray rooftops, the hazy glow of torchlight, the smoke that drifted upward from burning effigies of traitors. In every direction, the revolution's children were turning on one another. The ideals that once burned bright had become shadows, distorted and consuming. Robespierre's reflection glimmered faintly in the glass. The eyes staring back at him were not those of the man who once stood in defense of the poor or the powerless. They were hollowed, haunted. His cheeks were pale beneath the thin layer of sweat that never seemed to dry. The lines carved around his mouth deepened with every passing night, each one etched by 1,000 unspoken fears. He thought of his speeches, those sermons of virtue that had lifted him to near divine authority. He had declared that liberty could not survive without moral purity, that only the virtuous were fit to live. But now, standing alone in the choking heat of the revolution's final summer, even he could smell it, the rot beneath the righteousness. Outside, the bells tolled the hour. Another cart rolled by, wheels grinding against the cobblestones, carrying a dozen more names he had signed into oblivion. Somewhere in the distance, the blade fell again, followed by the crowd's hollow cheer. He flinched, just slightly, but enough to betray the truth he refused to speak aloud. The revolution he had once nurtured had grown monstrous. And like all monsters, it had learned to feed upon its creator. Still, he would not yield. In his mind, the sacrifice was holy, the cleansing justified. He would save France even if it meant drowning it in its own blood. And so he stood there, frozen in that sweltering room, watching the city suffocate beneath the weight of his ideals. His hands trembled not from weakness, but from the unbearable burden of conviction. Every breath he drew tasted of ash and guilt. Every beat of his heart echoed the distant fall of the blade. This was no longer the revolution of the people. It was the kingdom of fear, and Robespierre was its king. If you can still watch men fall and not feel the chill of power's corruption, then perhaps you've already become what this story warns you about. Subscribe or don't, but remember, silence made monsters thrive. Before the blade, before the terror, before his name became a curse whispered in the corridors of power, there was only a man, quiet, austere, almost fragile, walking the rain-soaked streets of Paris with a bundle of papers beneath his arm. His shoes were worn, his coat threadbare, and yet his gaze burned with something unshakable. In those early years, long before France began devouring her children, Maximilien Robespierre was a lawyer, a dreamer of reason, a disciple of justice, in a world built upon injustice. He believed that words could purify the soul of a nation. In courtrooms, his voice was soft but precise, slicing through hypocrisy like a scalpel through diseased flesh. He defended the poor against landlords, the accused against corruption, the powerless against the weight of privilege. The young advocate spoke not for coin or fame, but for principle, and in that conviction, he found his religion. Those who watched him in those early trials described him as incorruptible long before the revolution ever gave the word its meaning. When the first tremors of revolution began in 1789, he stepped into the National Assembly, small among giants, yet his presence drew silence. Others spoke of politics, he spoke of morality. While men like Mirabeau thundered of liberty, Robespierre whispered of virtue, not as an ideal, but as a weapon. To him, freedom without virtue was chaos, and chaos was sin. He believed the republic could not merely exist, it had to be pure. His speeches began as reasoned appeals. He stood on the wooden platform of the Jacobin Club, spectacles glinting in the candlelight, and spoke of the rights of man, of equality before the law, of a France that belonged to conscience rather than crowns. The audience leaned forward, entranced. His words seemed almost prophetic, calm, deliberate, touched by an eerie certainty. He did not shout. He commanded through restraint. And when he spoke of injustice, it was not passion that filled the room, but faith. He lived in a single rented room, slept little, and wrote endlessly. No lovers, no wine, no indulgence, only paper, ink, and the pursuit of purity. As others grew rich from the spoils of upheaval, Robespierre starved himself of pleasure, believing that temptation was treason. In that denial, he found power. People began to trust him not because he was charming, but because he seemed untouchable. They called him the incorruptible, and in time, he began to believe it himself. The revolution devoured its early heroes one by one, Mirabeau dead, Lafayette disgraced, Danton corrupted by pragmatism, and in the vacuum, Robespierre's voice grew louder. His speeches shifted from persuasion to proclamation, from reason to decree. What once sounded like virtue began to sound like scripture. He no longer argued. He judged, and the people, exhausted by betrayal and blood, listened. They needed a prophet, and he gave them one. In 1793, when France trembled under invasion and revolt, Robespierre ascended from moral voice to national savior. The Committee of Public Safety was born, 12 men given the power to preserve the revolution by any means. But it was his words that gave it purpose. He spoke of revolutionary virtue, a harmony between justice and terror. He said, if virtue is the soul of the republic, then terror is its instrument. Those words became law. Every speech he delivered now carried the weight of death. When Robespierre condemned a man, the guillotine followed. His voice was the breath of the republic, his silence its suffocation. In the clubs, in the streets, in the cafés of Paris, people quoted his sentences as if they were holy writ. But behind their reverence lingered unease. His faith had become too pure, too absolute, too consuming. In the spring of 1794, as the churches lay shattered and priests fled in chains, Robespierre unveiled his new creed, the cult of the Supreme Being. He declared that reason alone was not enough. France needed virtue sanctified. He spoke before thousands in the open air, beneath banners of blue and gold, wearing a sky-colored coat that caught the sun like celestial silk. The crowd cheered as choirs sang hymns to his new God, a God without Christ, without mercy, without forgiveness. And when he raised his arms toward heaven, many saw not a man, but a Messiah. But beneath the music and the fragrance of flowers, whispers moved through the crowd. They watched him descend the steps of his grand altar, a smile of satisfaction on his lips, and some murmured that the incorruptible now worshipped himself. Others saw in his calm expression something frightening, not holiness, but conviction without doubt. From that day, his name inspired awe and terror in equal measure. His voice, once a candle of reason, had become the flame that devoured everything around it. In the halls of the convention, men listened with bowed heads, afraid to interrupt. One word against him could mean ruin. The mere flicker of his disapproval could place a man's name on a list, and from that list there was no return. By the summer of 1794, Robespierre ruled France not with armies or gold, but with silence. His colleagues smiled when he entered, but their eyes betrayed them. They met in corners, behind closed doors, whispering of limits, of the need to stop him before he stopped them. Some trembled as they spoke his name, fearing that even the walls might carry his voice. And he, still convinced of his righteousness, saw their fear not as guilt, but as proof of conspiracy. The incorruptible had begun to see corruption everywhere, but within himself. He stood now at the height of his power and the edge of his ruin. The revolution had made him immortal in name, but it had also made him utterly alone. Every ally he had ever trusted was gone. Every admirer now whispered against him. Yet Robespierre, the man who once rose to defend the innocent, could no longer see innocence anywhere. And still his voice ruled France. If you can listen to a man build paradise on the corpses of his friends and not feel the frost of madness creeping into your chest, then perhaps the lesson of this story is already lost on you. Subscribe or don't, but remember, silence is how tyrants learn to speak. On the morning of June 8, 1794, Paris awoke beneath a sky of immaculate blue, a cruel, almost divine color that mocked the city it shone upon. The light spilled across the Champ de Mars, glinting off bayonets and gilded banners, illuminating a stage built not for kings, but for a prophet of the Republic. The air shimmered with heat, incense, and anticipation. For this was no ordinary ceremony. It was the festival of the Supreme Being, the day when virtue would be made sacred, and its high priest, Maximilien Robespierre, would ascend before the eyes of France. The smell of burning flowers drifted over the field, mingling with the wax of melting candles and the faint sourness of sweat rising from the waiting crowd. You can hear the rustle of thousands, citizens, soldiers, women in white linen, children carrying garlands, all standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the blazing sun. The guillotine had fallen silent for a single day, its blade resting like a weapon sheathed in piety. The drums that once summoned death now beat a slower rhythm, the tempo of ceremony, of obedience, of reverence. And then, through the haze of smoke and perfume, he appears. Maximilien Robespierre. He walks slowly, deliberately, every motion rehearsed, his figure radiant in a sky-blue coat, embroidered in silver, a sash of red and white slung across his chest. In his hand, he carries symbols of nature, sheaves of wheat, roses, and laurel. To the citizens, he looks like a statue come to life, a man anointed not by monarchy, but by moral purity. His eyes gleam beneath the sun, reflecting the very heavens he claims to serve. Behind him march the deputies of the National Convention, faces tight and unreadable. Some applaud, others lower their gaze. The air hums with music, trumpets, flutes, and the choral chant of Republican hymns composed for this single, monumental day. The voices rise across the square like smoke from 1,000 censers. Incense thickens the air, masking the city's usual stench of blood and ash. At the center of the field stands a mountain, a great, artificial mound of earth adorned with flowers, banners, and statues. Upon its summit waits an altar to the Supreme Being, radiant in gold. The man who once denounced idols now climbs toward his own. His every step is slow, measured, ceremonial, his feet pressing into the soft, newly laid soil as though ascending into the heavens themselves. From above, the sound of the crowd rolls like thunder. Tens of thousands watch in silence, the same people who, only days before, cheered the execution of their neighbors. Now they stare in awe as Robespierre reaches the summit, the blue of his coat blinding against the brilliance of the midday sun. For a moment, he stands still, framed by sky, flame, and music, and it seems that the revolution has given birth not to a man, but to a myth. Then he speaks. His voice cuts through the murmuring wind, steady and pure. He speaks of virtue, of justice, of the eternal harmony between man and nature. He tells them that reason without faith is barren, that liberty without virtue is crime. His tone is gentle, poetic, almost tender, but behind each phrase lies an edge sharper than any blade. He speaks not as one among men, but as one chosen to reveal the truth of the Republic itself. The crowd listens, entranced. But as his words rise, they grow heavier, darker. The poetry fades, command replaces it. His voice swells to a fevered pitch. He speaks of purity, of divine order, of enemies unseen, but everywhere. His eyes no longer rest on the people, they burn through them. Something shifts. The faces below begin to change. The applause falters. The air, once filled with reverence, thickens with unease. Mothers tighten their grip on their children's hands. Men glance sideways, afraid to be the first to stop clapping. Beneath the hymns, a new sound begins, the whisper of doubt. Has he become the god he once despised? Even his fellow deputies exchange anxious glances. They had seen Robespierre rise from humble advocate to the incorruptible guardian of the revolution. But now, standing upon that man-made mountain, haloed in sunlight and surrounded by flowers, they no longer see a guardian. They see a ruler. His virtue has become majesty. His faith has become possession. The music swells again, drowning their unease, but it cannot hide it. The flowers at the base of the altar are wilting under the heat. The incense thickens, suffocating, sweet, and rotten. The very air seems to bow beneath the weight of his words. When the final hymn ends, Robespierre descends from his mountain. The crowd parts before him, silent, obedient. But where reverence once filled their eyes, there is now something else, the beginning of fear. The festival, meant to unify, has exposed the fracture beneath his rule. By dusk, as the banners droop and the candles gutter out, the whispers begin to spread across the salons, the taverns, the chambers of the convention. They say he has crowned himself with divinity. They say the revolution has replaced one god with another, a man of flesh who believes himself eternal. And as Robespierre returns to his chamber that night, the faint echo of applause still ringing in his ears, he cannot hear what grows beneath it, the murmur of betrayal, the first stirrings of rebellion among his own. The same men who once chanted his name now speak it in silence. If you still believe virtue and power can coexist, prove it. Hit subscribe to Tale of History. Or scroll past, like those Parisians who watched and said nothing until the blade came for them. Paris no longer needed dawn to wake it. The city had learned to live by the rhythm of the drums and the guillotine's blade. Each day bled into the next, indistinguishable from the one before, marked only by the smell of smoke, sweat, and the faint copper tang that clung to the cobblestones long after the blood had dried. The guillotine no longer paused for breath. The tribunal worked like an unblinking eye, its judges mechanical, its verdicts inevitable. Names written on parchment by trembling hands became rivers of red that flowed through the gutters of the revolution. The streets that once echoed with cries of liberté now whispered only in fear. From the balconies above the square, the people had grown silent. Where there had once been applause, there was now an eerie stillness, a crowd without conviction, watching out of duty rather than belief. The executioner's arm rose and fell with monotonous precision. Heads rolled, baskets filled, and yet the lists kept growing. Within the tall chambers of the Committee of Public Safety, the air had turned heavy with distrust. Papers lay scattered across the long tables, stained with ink and candle wax. Faces that had once shared triumph now met only in wary glances. Each man spoke softly, measuring every word, as if even sound might betray him. Robespierre's chair stood at the head of the table. His presence alone commanded silence. The once lean and vibrant figure had grown pale, almost spectral. His powdered hair framed a face carved by sleeplessness, the eyes sunken yet still alight with that fierce, unyielding conviction that had carried him from obscurity to power. He listened more than he spoke now, but when he did, his voice held the gravity of law. He no longer argued, he pronounced. His words were not debate, but decree, each one cutting through the room with the finality of steel. And every decree demanded more heads. It began with the enemies of the Republic, then with the corrupt, then the doubters, then the slow, the hesitant, the unenthusiastic. And finally, it reached the faithful. Danton was among the first. His laughter had once filled the taverns of Paris. His words had lit the first fires of rebellion. But laughter was now considered indulgence, and indulgence was treason. When he stood trial, his voice, rich and thunderous, shook the court. He looked at the judges and spat, "Better to be guillotined today than guillotine others tomorrow." The words followed him to the scaffold, where he faced the crowd with eyes unblinking, refusing the blindfold. The blade fell, and the silence that followed was heavier than applause. Camille Desmoulins, the boyish firebrand, followed. His pamphlets had once defended the revolution's fury, but now he wrote of mercy, and mercy had become the language of betrayal. In his cell, he penned his last plea to Robespierre, calling him brother. The letter was never opened. On the morning of his execution, he called out for his wife. Her cries echoed from a nearby prison cell, where she waited for her own death. After their deaths, the committee grew quieter still. The men who once spoke loudly began to whisper. Those who had once looked Robespierre in the eye now lowered their gaze. He felt it, the hesitation, the reluctance, and in that hesitation he saw conspiracy. Every gesture became suspect. Every silence became guilt. The terror, once a weapon to cleanse the Republic, had turned inward, slicing through its own veins. Night after night, Robespierre sat alone at his desk beneath the weak light of a single candle. The windows were shuttered, the air stale. The scratching of his quill was the only movement in the room. Before him lay stacks of parchment, petitions, reports, accusations. He read them all, marking names with slow precision. His handwriting, once elegant, had become rigid, mechanical. The ink pressed deep into the page, as though he were carving into flesh. He paused often now, staring at the flame as it bent and twisted in the stillness. He saw faces in the light, Danton, Desmoulins, men he had called comrades, and for a fleeting moment his hand would tremble. But then the conviction returned, steady and cold. Their deaths had been necessary, he told himself. Virtue demanded sacrifice, and virtue could not err. Outside, the city slept in fear. The faint clatter of distant carts echoed through the streets. Every home held its breath. A single knock at the door could end a family before sunrise. Even his closest allies began to sense it, that the man who ruled in the name of purity had become purity's prisoner. His eyes, once clear and human, now burned with something far beyond faith. He no longer trusted anyone. The slightest question, the faintest doubt, became evidence of treason. The revolution's prophet had turned inquisitor. Within the Jacobin Club, the air grew tense and brittle. Attendance dwindled. Men once proud to call themselves Robespierre'S began to stay away. In their absence, the speeches grew longer, the audience quieter. When Robespierre spoke now, even applause felt rehearsed, perfunctory, a ritual meant to hide fear. His words had changed too. They carried no warmth, no humanity, only the cold precision of belief. He spoke of cleansing, of duty, of eternal vigilance. His voice was no longer a plea for justice. It was a sermon demanding obedience. Each syllable struck like a verdict. And yet, when he returned home, he carried the same solitude that haunted him since the first blood was spilled. He wrote until dawn, surrounded by papers, his reflection flickering in the glass. The candlelight distorted his features, splitting his image, one man righteous, the other hollow. Those who saw him in those final weeks spoke of a man already walking among ghosts. His coat hung loose on his frame, his skin pale as wax. The world outside his chamber had receded into rumor and shadow. The incorruptible had withdrawn into the narrow circle of his own faith. But even faith, left too long in darkness, begins to decay. If you have watched the architect of justice become its prisoner and still believe that virtue survives the taste of power, then you have learned nothing from the blood of revolutions. Subscribe to Tale of History, because history does not whisper, it warns. The candlelight inside the Tuileries hall flickered against the walls like a fever. Outside, Paris held its breath, heavy with heat and rumor. It was the eve of 8 Thermidor, year 2, July 26, 1794, and Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, was preparing to speak once more before the National Convention. The revolution had entered its 24th month of terror, and though the guillotine had long since gone silent for the night, the air itself still carried the echo of its blade. He arrived late in the day, his face gaunt, his lips pale, his hand clutching a single sealed document. No one knew what it contained, but in that silence before he spoke, even the air seemed to lean forward to listen. The deputies of the convention shifted uneasily in their seats. The sound of papers being straightened, boots scraping against the floor, all the nervous habits of men who sense the moment before judgment. Robespierre mounted the rostrum slowly. He paused, scanning the assembly with an expression unreadable, his eyes hollow yet burning with purpose. The chamber's lamps glimmered on his powdered hair, and the murmurs died into a heavy stillness. The man who had ruled through the voice of virtue now stood before the men who feared his silence more than his words. He broke the seal. The parchment unfurled with a soft crackle, the sound crisp and final. And then he began. His voice was calm at first, low and deliberate. He spoke of treason within the Republic, of men whose hands were unclean, though their tongues still spoke the language of virtue. He spoke of corruption hidden in the folds of power, of secret enemies cloaked in patriotism. His tone rose slowly, line by line, his cadence sharpening, each word echoing across the marble walls. But then he stopped short of naming them. The deputies shifted, exchanging quick glances. He spoke of traitors, yet he left their faces in shadow. And in that omission, he condemned them all. Every man in that chamber felt the blade's edge turn toward him. Each heartbeat seemed louder than the last. His eyes swept the room. When he paused, the silence was unbearable. The deputies dared not meet his gaze. They sat rigid in their seats, half listening, half counting the seconds until their own names might be spoken. But no names came. Only accusation. Only judgment. He declared that the Republic was infested, that virtue itself was under siege by men masquerading as patriots. He said that until these impostors were revealed, the revolution could not be saved. His voice grew louder, clearer, cutting through the air like polished steel. Still, he named no one. The speech lasted for hours. By the time he finished, sweat darkened his collar, and his hands trembled around the edges of the parchment. He looked out at the assembly, expecting applause, but what he saw instead was dread. The deputies stared back in silence, not with admiration, but with calculation. He had made every man in that hall an enemy. As he left the rostrum, whispers filled the chamber, hushed at first, then louder. Who does he mean? Whose name is written on that list? If he accuses one, he accuses all. The men of the committee exchanged glances, their faces pale beneath the light. Barras, Tallien, Billaud, Carnot, names that once stood beside his in unity, now burned with fear. The incorruptible had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. That night, Paris did not sleep. In the corridors of the convention, men gathered in corners, speaking in tones too low to carry. They called it the Night of Lists. No one knew how long the document was, or whose names it contained, only that its author was capable of delivering every one of them to the blade. The next morning, 9 Thermidor. The air inside the convention was electric with dread. Deputies entered with their wigs hastily powdered, their eyes swollen from sleeplessness. They had not met to debate, they had met to survive. When Robespierre appeared, escorted by his loyal Saint-Just and Guillotine, the room erupted into motion. His enemies rose first, Tallien, trembling but resolute, his hand gripping a dagger hidden beneath his coat. He pointed across the floor and shouted, "It is time to end the tyrant." The chamber broke into chaos. Men stood on benches, shouting over one another, their faces red with fury and terror. Some called for Robespierre's arrest, others for his defense. The sound became deafening, boots pounding, fists slamming on wood, voices rising until the meaning of words was lost to noise. Robespierre tried to speak. His mouth opened, but the roar of the hall drowned him out. He raised his hands, demanding silence, but the air had turned against him. Every voice that had once fallen still at his command now shouted in rebellion. He turned toward the president's chair, eyes wild, demanding the right to reply. The president's gavel struck once, then twice. "You have no right to reply." The incorruptible's voice broke, the voice that had ruled France, the voice that had ordered life and death with divine certainty, now cracking under the weight of its own echo. His allies attempted to defend him, but it was too late. The tide had shifted. His name, once sacred, was now spat like venom. The same men who had cheered his sermons now cried for his arrest. By noon, the vote was taken. The decree passed. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Guillotine, the guardians of the revolution, were declared enemies of the Republic. Guards flooded the chamber. His pen had written too many names. Now his own had joined them. As he was led away through the corridors of the hall, the city outside seemed eerily still, as if the air itself hesitated. The whispers that followed him were no longer those of reverence or fear, but something colder: inevitability. That night, in the Hôtel de Ville, he would wait for the end he had written for so many others. The night of lists had become the night of reckoning. You can turn away now. Pretend history doesn't repeat itself. But every revolution dies this same death at the hands of its own believers. Subscribe to Tale of History if you dare to keep watching. The morning of 9 Thermidor, Year 2, began like any other in Paris. Thick with heat and dust, the air clinging to the skin, the city unwilling to breathe. Yet beneath that familiar stillness, the ground was shifting. The Republic trembled upon its own foundations, and those who had once spoken Robespierre's name in reverence now whispered it like a curse. Inside the National Convention, the atmosphere was suffocating. The hall, vast and echoing, smelled of sweat, ink, and wax, the scent of men cornered by their own creation. Deputies filed into their seats with tight jaws and lowered eyes. The sunlight that spilled through the high windows seemed harsh and unkind, catching the dust that drifted between them like a swarm of restless spirits. When Robespierre entered, the room stiffened. His sky-blue coat, the same that had once dazzled the crowds at the feast of the Supreme Being, had dulled with wear, its edges creased, its brilliance gone. He moved with the slow precision of a man who believed the world itself awaited his command. Behind him followed his closest allies, Saint-Just, tall and severe, his youth hardened into fanaticom; Guillotine, pale and trembling, wheeled forward by aides; and Augustin Robespierre, the brother who had stood beside him through every flame and whisper. The hall fell silent. Every sound seemed to wait. Robespierre took the floor. He began to speak. His words were meant to steady the Republic, to defend his virtue, to silence the tide of suspicion swelling around him. But the moment his voice reached the air, it met resistance, not from argument, but from rage. Across the hall, Tallien rose first, his hands shaking, his eyes sharp with fear disguised as courage. His voice cracked the silence like the first peal of thunder. "We are ruled by a tyrant in the name of liberty," he shouted. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Then Gruesome stood, his voice rough with exhaustion. "He speaks of purity," he said, "but he stains this hall with blood." Others joined, one by one, until their voices merged into a storm of accusation. The air grew thick with noise, boots striking the floor, fists slamming on desks, the low roar of panic masquerading as courage. Robespierre tried to rise above it. His voice, once calm and measured, strained against the chaos. He pointed toward the president's chair, his face pale, his lips trembling. "President of assassins," he shouted. But his cry was lost in the rising flood. "Down with the tyrant," they screamed back. The chant spread like fire through the hall, each voice fueling the next. "Down with the tyrant! Down with the tyrant!" The incorruptible's voice cracked. His words dissolved beneath the echo of his own undoing. He looked from face to face and saw only hatred reflected back. The men who had once applauded his sermons now leaned forward with eyes like blades. For the first time, he understood that he was no longer the judge, but the condemned. His brother Augustine tried to reach him, shouting above the din, but was seized by guards before he could cross the floor. Saint Just, that stern angel of the revolution, stood unmoved, his face expressionless, as soldiers surrounded him. Cuthin, half paralyzed, clutched the arms of his chair as he was dragged from the dais, his quill and papers scattering across the floor. When the vote was called, no one dared abstain. The decree passed in a single, thunderous voice. Robespierre and his allies were declared outlaws, beyond the protection of law, stripped of defense or mercy. The hall that had once trembled at his silence now erupted in triumph. Deputies pounded their desks with fists and canes, drowning out every attempt he made to speak. His lips moved, his hands raised as if to command attention, but the words never reached the air. The voice that had shaped the Republic had been swallowed by it. Guards stepped forward. The clatter of sabers and boots echoed through the chamber. Robespierre did not resist as they closed around him. His head bowed slightly, as though the weight of the revolution itself had settled upon his shoulders. When the soldiers took him by the arm, he did not struggle. He merely whispered, "They will destroy the Republic." Outside, the news spread faster than the sound of the drums. Crowds gathered along the boulevards, drawn not by curiosity, but by disbelief. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths now stood under arrest, his wrists bound, his eyes hollow. The procession moved through the streets of Paris, flanked by soldiers. No one cheered. No one cursed. The people simply watched. The cries of "Vive Robespierre" had vanished. Only the creak of the cart's wheels and the muffled steps of the guards filled the air. Mothers pulled their children close. Vendors shut their stalls. The silence that followed him was heavier than any song of praise. For the first time in years, the crowd looked upon the architect of their fear and saw not a savior, not even a villain, only a man. His powdered hair hung limp against his temples. The once bright blue coat was wrinkled, dust clinging to its sleeves. The fire that had burned so fiercely in his eyes flickered and dimmed. As he was dragged past the Hotel de Ville, he turned his face upward toward the gray sky, as if searching for the divine hand he had once claimed to serve. But the heavens remained silent. The Republic had found its scapegoat, and the gods had turned away. By nightfall, he and his companions were locked within the walls of the Luxembourg prison. The rooms were damp, the air rank with mildew and despair. From the window, Robespierre could see the faint glow of the city he once ruled. Each flicker of light reminded him of the torches that had once followed his parades, the fires that now marked the beginning of his end. In the streets, men drank to his downfall. The very same citizens who had once bowed to his words now toasted his ruin. The taverns filled with laughter, the sound of relief disguised as joy. But even amid that celebration, unease lingered. The people of Paris had learned too well the price of judgment. They knew that today's executioner could be tomorrow's victim. And still, the drums rolled through the night. The storm of Thermidor had begun, and the man who once claimed to cleanse France of its monsters had become the final offering to his own creation. You can turn away now. Tell yourself this was history, not warning. But every generation births its own Robespierre, every nation its own Thermidor. Subscribe to Tale of History if you have the courage to keep watching. Night had fallen heavy over Paris. The air, thick with July heat, pressed against the shutters of every house along Rue Saint-Honoré, carrying with it the low hum of a city trembling between exhaustion and revolt. Somewhere beyond the darkened rooftops, the bells of midnight prepared to toll, their echoes crawling through the narrow streets like approaching footsteps. The reign of terror had reached its final breath, and inside the Hôtel de Ville, the man who had once ruled France with words sharper than blades now waited for history to collect its debt. Maximilien Robespierre sat at a long oak table, surrounded by the last of his allies, Saint Just, pale and solemn as a carved statue, Guillotine slumped in his chair, his trembling hands folded over a pile of forgotten papers, and his younger brother, Augustine, restless, pacing the floor with the quiet rage of a man already mourning the living. The candles burned low, their wax spilling onto the wooden surface like tears. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and fear, the scent of power rotting in real time. Outside, distant gunfire echoed through the streets, faint but growing closer. Troops loyal to the convention had begun to surround the square. The once loyal National Guard, unsure whom to obey, hesitated in the shadows. Windows flickered with torchlight, and in the narrow alleyways, whispers turned to shouts. The city that had once bowed to Robespierre's was now converging upon his refuge like a predator scenting blood. Inside the hall, time seemed suspended. Papers littered the table, declarations, proclamations, decrees, each one written with the same unshakable certainty that had carried him from obscurity to infamy. He dictated orders to secretaries who had already fled, spoke sentences no one would record, and sealed documents no one would ever read. His voice, though calm, betrayed the strain of disbelief, the disbelief of a man who could not accept that the Republic had turned its blade toward him. Saint Just stood by the window, gazing out into the blackness, where the faint glow of muskets flashed like distant lightning. "We must rally the faithful," he said, his tone unyielding, the voice of a zealot clinging to faith after the temple has fallen. But the room offered no answer. No soldiers came. No voices rose in defense. The silence that followed was absolute. Robespierre straightened in his chair, the quill still in his hand. His eyes, red with sleeplessness, darted between the door and the flickering shadows on the walls. Each sound, the creak of the floorboards, the crack of a distant rifle, seemed to tighten the air further around him. He had lived by suspicion, and now suspicion consumed him whole. Hours passed like years. The last candle guttered and died, leaving only the faint light of the moon spilling through the high windows. The room was drenched in gray. Someone outside shouted orders, harsh, hurried, unmistakable. Then came the unmistakable rhythm of marching boots. Guillotine crossed himself, whispering prayers between clenched teeth. Saint Just stood motionless, his jaw set. Augustine gripped his brother's arm, whispering, "We are betrayed." Robespierre did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on the door. A single musket crack split the silence, followed by a cry and the splintering of wood. Then chaos. The doors burst open, crashing against a stone. Smoke filled the room, thick and blinding, carrying with it the stench of gunpowder. Shouts of "Down with the tyrant" drowned out every other sound. Soldiers poured into the chamber, their bayonets glinting in the moonlight. Robespierre rose, staggering backward. His papers scattered across the floor like the fragments of his decrees, his words, his laws, his reign, blown apart in an instant. The noise became unbearable, gunfire, footsteps, screams. A flash of light, the whistle of a bullet, and then silence broken by a single sickening crack. The shot struck him across the jaw. Whether fired by his own trembling hand or by one of the soldiers remains forever uncertain. Blood poured down his chin, soaking the collar of his shirt, staining the papers that moments before had declared the moral purity of the Republic. He fell against the table, his body folding beneath the weight of shock. The quill rolled from his fingers, its black ink mingling with the red that spread across the wood. Saint Just lunged forward, shouting his name, but another volley silenced him. Guillotine slumped in his chair, the wheel of it turning slowly as the smoke swirled. Augustine Robespierre, desperate, leapt from the window rather than surrender. His body struck the pavement below with the final sound of defiance. The soldiers stormed through the building, seizing the last survivors. The once holy hall of the Revolution now reeked of sweat, blood, and broken glass. Men trampled over fallen papers, their boots grinding the decrees of virtue into the floorboards. In the corner, beneath the shattered table, Robespierre lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His eyes flickered open briefly, empty, unseeing, glistening in the firelight. At dawn, the Hôtel de Ville stood silent. Smoke drifted from its shattered windows, curling upward into the pale sky. The people of Paris gathered below, craning their necks to see the aftermath. Soldiers emerged dragging the wounded leader, his jaw bound in a filthy bandage, his hands limp at his sides. The incorruptible had been silenced, not by debate, not by argument, but by his own weapon, violence. As he was carried into the street, the crowd did not cheer. No voices rose in triumph. They simply stared, as though beholding the ghost of their own creation. The man who had ruled through fear was now only flesh, broken, bleeding, and silent. He had built a world where dissent was death. Now, in his final hours, he learned the price of absolute silence. He fought to silence every voice but his own. Now his silence is all that remains. Don't be another silent witness. Subscribe to Tale of History, or ask yourself why you won't. Dawn came gray and trembling over Paris, dragging its light across a city that no longer knew how to wake without dread. The streets were slick from the night's rain, their puddles reflecting the dim glow of torches that still burned from the long hours of the previous night. The bells tolled slowly, mournfully, and with each distant peal, the rumor spread like smoke through the alleys and squares. Robespierre will die today. It began as a whisper from a guard's lips, then a murmur through the marketplace, then a chorus across the bridges of the Seine. The butcher stopped his blade mid-swing. The baker's hand froze above the dough. The very air seemed to still, as though Paris itself had exhaled for the first time in years. They came by the thousands, men, women, children, the same faces that had once cheered his speeches, now pressing against one another for a glimpse of the fallen idol. By morning, the streets were lined with bodies and breath, a sea of eyes waiting for the procession that would carry the ghost of the revolution to its grave. Inside the cell, Maximilien Robespierre stirred as the guards approached. His hands were bound behind him with coarse rope, his head swathed in blood-soaked bandages that clung to his jaw and neck. His coat, torn and stiff with dried blood, still bore the faint blue of his former grandeur. The doctor had tried to stop the bleeding through the night, but the wound would not close. The bandage had fused with the flesh, and every breath he took sent a low, guttural moan through the hall. He could not speak. The voice that had once commanded nations was now a muffled rattle of air behind torn muscle and shattered bone. When the guards lifted him from the cot, he swayed on unsteady legs, his body trembling beneath the weight of his own ruin. In the adjoining cells, the others waited, Saint-Just unflinching, his expression serene, as if he already walked among saints. Couthon, pale and trembling, slumped in his chair, the paralysis of his body now indistinguishable from resignation. Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother, staring blankly at the stone wall, lips moving in silent prayer. One by one, they were gathered and chained, their footsteps echoing down the narrow corridor like the march of a dying era. The heavy doors opened, and light spilled into the prison courtyard. The carts were waiting. Rough wooden platforms, wheels caked in mud, the same carts that had carried nobles, priests, peasants, poets, now waiting for their maker. The horses stamped their hooves, snorting clouds of steam into the morning chill. The air was thick with the smell of iron, sweat, and rot. When Robespierre was lifted into the first cart, the crowd gasped. His head hung low, the bandage around his jaw stained a deep, sickly crimson. The soldiers tied him upright so the city could see what remained of its savior. The wound had swollen, distorting his face into something almost inhuman. The procession began. Drums rolled in slow, deliberate rhythm, the same rhythm that had once announced the fall of kings. Now it marked the fall of the man who had dethroned them. The horses moved at a steady pace, hooves striking the stones like the ticking of a vast and merciless clock. The crowd parted as they passed, but no one cheered. No one dared whisper. Then slowly the silence broke, not with reverence, but with hatred reborn. Mud flew first, then stones. Someone shouted, "There goes the butcher of Paris." Another spat, "Virtue bleeds today." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. The people he had promised to save hurled curses at the broken man who could no longer answer them. The more they shouted, the more they seemed to believe they were free. Robespierre did not raise his head. He could not. His vision blurred with blood and dust. He watched only the ground before him, the wheel turning, the earth passing beneath his feet. The smell of horses mixed with sweat and decay, and through it all came the faint, rhythmic beat of the drums, the endless heartbeat of the guillotine waiting in the distance. The carts wound through the same streets he had once paraded in triumph. The same buildings that had echoed his speeches now watched in silence as their prophet was dragged beneath their windows. Some faces turned away, others leaned out to see, to confirm that the nightmare was ending. By the time the procession reached the Place de la Revolution, the crowd had grown into a tide. The scaffold loomed ahead, dark and soaked from a storm. The blade glistened, catching the first rays of sunlight. The wooden platform creaked under the weight of its own history. Thousands had mounted it. None had returned. The prisoners were unloaded one by one. Guillotine was carried first, his crippled body bound to a chair. Then Saint Just, walking with unflinching calm, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd. When Robespierre's turn came, the guards dragged him by the arms, his legs unable to bear him. The bandage slipped as they pulled him upright, revealing the mangled ruin beneath. A collective hiss rippled through the audience. Some covered their mouths, others laughed. He was placed before the scaffold. The executioner stepped forward to remove the bandage, but Robespierre flinched, a strangled sound escaping his throat, a noise that was neither scream nor speech, only pain made flesh. The cloth tore away, reopening the wound. Blood poured down his chest, soaking his shirt anew. The crowd recoiled, then laughed louder. The revolution had come to feed upon its high priest. For a moment, he lifted his eyes toward the sky. There was no triumph in them, no plea, no defiance. Only the hollow reflection of a man who had outlived his purpose. His lips parted as if to speak, to say one final word, but only a wet gasp came forth. The executioner seized his hair, forcing his head beneath the blade. The drum ceased. The city waited. A single cry rose from the scaffold, a voice lost beneath the roar of the crowd. Then the rope was pulled. The blade fell. The sound was sharp, clean, absolute. The head that had once commanded armies, decreed death, and defined the republic rolled into the basket with a dull thud. A cheer erupted, not of joy, but of release. The people shouted, not in celebration of virtue, but in relief that their tormentor could no longer speak. The man who silenced a nation had been silenced forever. The cart was emptied. The body, headless and pale, was tossed among the others. Blood seeped between the cracks of the scaffold and down onto the stones below. The square smelled of iron and rain. Above, crows circled, their black wings slicing through the brightening sky. The drums began again, slower now, almost mournful. The crowd dispersed. Within an hour, the square was nearly empty. The blade dripped once, then stood still. He once spoke of liberty. Now his voice feeds the crows. If you've watched this far without subscribing, ask yourself, are you any different from those who applauded the fall of every dreamer? Subscribe to Tale of History before silence makes its home again. When the blade fell, the echo did not end with it. It rolled through Paris like a whisper through stone corridors, fading only to linger in the corners of the city's breath. For the first time in years, there were no names shouted from balconies, no drums calling the condemned, no speeches rising like thunder from the halls of the convention. The noise of revolution had ended not with an explosion, but with a sigh. The square where Robespierre died still steamed with the heat of blood. The scaffold stood silent, the straw below soaked dark, the wooden boards creaking under the weight of memory. But as the morning stretched forward, Paris began to move again. The city that had once frozen in terror now stirred, hesitant, as though afraid to believe that death had finally loosened its grip. Vendors reopened their stalls. Bread was sold again where heads had fallen the night before. The scent of fresh loaves drifted through the same air that had reeked of decay and iron. Children ran through the streets, chasing each other past the stains that the rain could not wash away. The taverns filled slowly, uncertainly, their patrons speaking in low voices, testing laughter as though it were a fragile, forbidden thing. And yet, beneath that thin veil of normalcy, the silence throbbed. It was not peace, it was the exhaustion of a nation that had screamed too long. Every window still carried the memory of the banners. Every street still remembered the tramp of boots. The shadows of the guillotine's blades stretched invisible over the city, a dark geometry drawn upon every stone. Paris was free, they said. But freedom had come at a price too high for anyone to count aloud. In the back rooms of the convention, papers were burned. Orders signed in haste, lists of names, testimonies that no longer served their purpose. Men who had once shouted for justice now whispered of reconciliation. Others sat in silence, their eyes hollow, as if afraid that one wrong word might wake the terror again. They had outlived their monster, but the echo of its breath still lingered on their skin. In the hospitals, rows of wounded lay forgotten. Some had been soldiers of the Republic, others the victims of its wrath. The doctors moved between them with faces of stone, their hands steady but their eyes vacant. They no longer asked who was innocent or guilty, only who might survive the night. Outside the city, on the outskirts where the carts of death had once passed each morning, a line of wagons moved one final time. They carried bodies stripped of name and rank, Saint-Just, Couthon, Maximilien Robespierre, and the others, piled together like the debris of an era. The bodies were dumped in a common pit at the edge of the cemetery of Arancis. No priest came to speak. No flag was raised. No words were written. Lime was scattered over the corpses to quicken their decay. Among them lay Maximilien Robespierre, the man who once claimed to embody the incorruptible soul of France. His face was gone, his voice extinguished, his body indistinguishable from those he had condemned. In that pit, kings and cobblers were equals, ministers and beggars indistinguishable. The Republic had fulfilled its promise of equality. At last, in death. Days passed. The scaffold was taken down. The guillotine's blade, dulled from use, was sent to storage. The crowd that once chanted for purity now murmured for bread, for rest, for forgetfulness. The city moved on, not because it healed, but because it could not bear to look back. Yet the ghosts remained. They lingered in the doorways where soldiers had once dragged their neighbors into the night. They watched from the bridges where bodies had been thrown into the Seine. The river carried their names in its current, names unspoken, erased, lost beneath the triumph of survival. Those who lived spoke cautiously of the past. In taverns, men swore they had never supported the terror. Women whispered of the relatives they had lost, but never aloud, never in daylight. The revolution, they said, was over. But the silence that followed it was not freedom. It was the silence of fear wearing the mask of relief. And somewhere beneath the soil, beneath the weight of quicklime and anonymity, the man who once judged the world lay forgotten. His bones, stripped of grandeur, rested among the nameless dead. The voice that had promised virtue to a nation had vanished into the dust. There would be no tomb, no statue, no shrine. The incorruptible had become incorporeal, nothing more than a caution, a whisper, a warning. Above, Paris continued. Children laughed again. Lovers met in secret. The markets thrived. But the air never quite cleared. The smell of smoke lingered for years, faint but unshakable, like the memory of something burned too deeply to forget. The revolution had devoured its children and then sat in the ruins, silent, staring at its own hands. And so it ended, not with a cry for liberty, but with the hush that follows a blade. If you think the story ends with his death, you've already missed its meaning. History does not bury its ghosts. It waits for them to rise again. Subscribe to Tale of History and listen before silence becomes your teacher. Long after the blade fell, his voice did not die. It lingered, faint and persistent, in the corners of France's conscience, not as a cry of defiance, but as a whisper that refused to be silenced. For years after his execution, people still spoke his name in low tones, with uncertainty in their eyes, as though invoking a specter that could hear and judge them still. Was Maximilien Robespierre a monster or a martyr? Even his enemies could not answer, without hesitation. The revolution had ended him, but not the question of what he truly was. To some, he was the tyrant who strangled liberty with her own chains, the man who made virtue a weapon and turned justice into execution. To others, he was the last pure soul in a corrupt world, the idealist consumed by the very fire he lit. And in the decades that followed, the shadow of his name would stretch farther than his life ever had. The records of the time speak in contradictions. Revolutionary documents call him the incorruptible, the defender of the people, the prophet of virtue. But the memoirs that followed, penned by survivors, opportunists, and ghosts in powdered wigs, describe him as a phantom of reason gone mad, a man who believed himself the conscience of humanity and mistook his reflection for God. In the archives of the Revolution, his words still bleed through ink faded by time. To punish the oppressor of humanity is clemency. To forgive them is barbarity. What he once meant as conviction, history would remember as warning. When the century turned, and the revolution became memory instead of terror, his ghost lingered in the corridors of power. None felt it more keenly than Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor, who had risen from the ashes of that same chaos, would later confess that the specter of Robespierre haunted him more than any rival. Not his generals, not his assassins, but the cold, incorruptible figure of the man who had ruled by ideals instead of armies. Napoleon feared what Robespierre represented, not failure, but faith. The kind of faith that bends the world until it breaks. He once remarked to his ministers, Robespierre believed himself virtue incarnate. He thought himself eternal. There is no greater danger than a man who believes himself pure. And yet, even Napoleon could not destroy his ghost. The incorruptible lived on not as a man, but as an idea, an uncomfortable mirror held up to every leader who came after. For history, in its cruelty, has a way of repeating what it refuses to understand. The revolution that began in Paris would echo again, in the snows of Russia, in the fevered streets of China, in every movement that sought to purify the world by force. Always the same promise, always the same fall, liberty turning to fear, virtue to blood. Robespierre's dream was never buried with his bones. It evolved, shape-shifting across centuries, reborn each time humanity mistook righteousness for justice. Each time someone declared that they alone could define good and evil, his ghost stirred. Philosophers would write of him as both saint and specter. Some called him the last honest man of the revolution, others the first murderer of the modern world. But all agreed on one truth. He revealed the danger of purity, that when men believe themselves incorruptible, corruption begins in their hearts. The historian Jules Michelet once wrote, he wished to make men angels, and he made them corpses. And perhaps that is the closest truth there is. Because Robespierre was not born cruel. He began with ideas so luminous they blinded him. He believed in virtue so fiercely that he could no longer see humanity. And when a man stops seeing people, he sees only principles, and blood always follows. His tragedy was not in his death, but in his belief that he was right until the very end. The reign of terror was not born from hatred, but from moral certainty, from the conviction that killing the impure was the only way to save the world. And so every age since has faced its own Robespierre, not in a man, but in the mirror, in the leaders who speak of cleansing, in the crowds who cheer for order at any cost, in the citizens who stay silent, believing that virtue justifies cruelty, that ends excuse the means. From Paris to Petrograd, from the guillotine to the gulag, his voice echoes still, a whisper in the darkness. To cleanse the world, we must first destroy it. The world remembers his fall, but not the question that fell with him. What is justice, when justice has no mercy? Time has tried to erase his face, his words, his failures. But the shadow remains. The incorruptible did not vanish. He became a warning carved into history itself. And if you listen closely, when the powerful speak of virtue while blood stains their hands, when crowds chant for purity as smoke rises in the distance, you can still hear him. Still whispering through the centuries. Still asking, who decides who deserves to live? Every revolution begins in light and ends in shadow. Every ideal burns brightest just before it turns to ash. The silence after the blade was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of its echo. If you believe history cannot repeat itself, you've already proven it will. Subscribe to Tale of History, because forgetting is how the next guillotine begins to rise. The terror ended not with triumph, but with fatigue. When Robespierre's head rolled into the wicker basket beneath the guillotine, the revolution did not celebrate. It exhaled. France was not healed, it was emptied. The screams that had echoed through the corridors of the convention, through the streets of Paris, through the dreams of every citizen, were replaced by something heavier than sound. Silence. A silence so deep it felt sacred, and yet it was not peace, it was exhaustion. The Thermidorian reaction began before the blood on the scaffold had dried. Those who had trembled before the incorruptible now rose to erase him. The Jacobin clubs were shut down, their symbols stripped from the walls. The words virtue, purity, incorruptibility, once spoken as commandments, became dangerous. Anyone who uttered them too loudly was met with suspicion. The same men who had cheered Robespierre's decrees now spat his name as if to cleanse themselves of memory. Paris, once the beating heart of revolution, now throbbed with regret. The tricolor flags that had once fluttered with pride were torn, faded by rain and smoke. The city squares, once crowded with tribunals and mobs, became markets again, though no one could quite bring themselves to laugh as they once had. The very air seemed different, as though the wind carried with it a faint metallic scent that could never be washed away. The convention, in its new caution, began to rewrite the story. The years of blood became necessary measures. The reign of terror was rebranded as an excess of virtue. The records were scrubbed, the speeches rephrased, the minutes edited, so that the revolution might appear cleaner in the pages of history than it ever was in life. But the stains remained. In the halls of power, men whispered that they had seen the devil himself in the face of Robespierre, that his voice had mesmerized the nation, that his eyes had gleamed like those of a prophet. Others, quieter and fewer, argued that he had been betrayed by his own faith, that he had wanted too much, demanded too purely, and was destroyed because the world could not bear his conviction. His name became taboo. For years, it was forbidden to speak it within the convention. In salons and drawing rooms, those who had once dined with him denied ever knowing the man. His likeness was erased from portraits. His writings were locked away. The revolution, now weary and embarrassed of its own creation, tried to bury him not once, but twice. First beneath the blade, then beneath forgetfulness. But memory is never obedient. Whispered in secret, his name survived. Among the poor, the dispossessed, the young idealists who still dreamed of justice, Robespierre became something else, a legend. To them, he was not the tyrant of blood-soaked decrees, but the martyr of principle. The man who refused to bend, who died for an idea too pure for the world that birthed it. Pamphlets emerged in secret decades later, calling him the friend of the people. His speeches were republished, his words quoted by those who still believed the revolution had been betrayed. The Thermidorians could ban his name from their chambers, but not from the hearts of those who saw in him the reflection of their own yearning for truth. And as the years turned to decades, legend hardened into myth. Pain became nostalgia. Terror became romance. The same Paris that had once spit on his broken body now immortalized him in marble. Streets were named for him. Statues rose. Scholars debated him. Artists painted his likeness not as a monster, but as a fallen angel of the Republic, brilliant, uncompromising, doomed. Time had done what time always does. It polished the blade until the reflection shone. Yet the truth remained in the soil beneath the city, where his bones lay scattered among those he condemned. The revolution's purity had consumed its prophet, and in doing so, had revealed what every age must learn, that no cause, however righteous, survives untainted by the hands that wield it. France emerged blood-soaked, but alive. The fever had broken, but the scar remained. The dream of liberty had survived, though altered, its brilliance dimmed, its edges roughened by the memory of how easily justice had become death. The streets filled again with laughter, but not innocence. The laughter of a people who had seen too much and learned too little. The markets opened, but the sellers looked over their shoulders. The children played, but their parents still flinched at the roll of distant drums. The guillotine had been dismantled, but its shadow lingered in the minds of all who had watched it fall. Years later, Napoleon would march beneath the same Parisian sky, the empire rising where the Republic had burned. He would rule with the precision of a man who had studied every mistake of the revolution. And among those mistakes, one name haunted him most: Robespierre. The incorruptible had become incorruptible in a different way, beyond touch, beyond revision. The world had destroyed him to forget him, yet in doing so, had ensured that he would never die. His face remained the mirror that every generation was forced to look into and flinch. He wanted to cleanse the world. The world cleansed itself of him. But the question he left behind still festers beneath the pages of history. Can a nation seek purity without drowning in its own reflection? If you've listened this far, you already know the answer. Subscribe to Tale of History, because the ghosts of the past never sleep, and those who stop listening are always the first to repeat them.